And hello, everyone. My name is Ann-Herod Lang. For those of you who are joining us for the first time on this platform, I'm the Executive Director of PHAP, that's short for the International Association of Professionals in Humanitarian Assistance and Protection. Very pleased to be serving once again as your co-host. This is the second session in our new series together with ICVA and PHAP, a learning stream on humanitarian coordination. So this is focusing on the humanitarian coordination mechanisms at country level primarily today, and we'll also be addressing some models of regional coordination. I'd like to mention as we get going with today's event, this discussion in this series is made possible by ICVA, and it's presented as part of PHAP's Geneva Humanitarian Connector initiative with additional baseline support provided by the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs. Great to see all of you with us, and now I'd like to introduce my co-host Emmanuel Osman from ICVA.
Yes, hello everyone. Sorry, I'm Emmanuel. I'm the Senior Policy Officer for Humanitarian Coordination at ICVA. Greetings and welcome to everyone. I see that we have today many participants coming from all over the world. I see colleagues from Kenya, from Jordan, from Turkey, from Pakistan. Well, I hope you enjoy the webinar today.
So then, without further ado, we will get into the substance of today's session. We're going to be focused, as mentioned, on the main coordination structures and actors involved in humanitarian response at country level that are of particularly high relevance to NGOs. So for this, we've invited 4 guest experts to explore and analyze the different country level mechanisms from their own perspectives. We're going to focus on the coordination at country level, as I said, but we'll also try to examine some of the existing models of regional coordination and how NGOs can better engage in these coordination mechanisms at both country and regional levels.
Yes, and learning objectives of these sessions are to get to know the coordination mechanisms that are available at country level. You will be familiar with the key actors at country level and their main roles. Also to raise awareness of the opportunities and challenges for NGOs to engage in country level and regional level coordination mechanisms. And you will get also familiar with sources of information on coordination structures at country and regional levels.
So joining us today, I'll begin by introducing Kirk Pritchard. Kirk, you may remember him from our first session in this series. Kirk is Director of Humanitarian Programs at Concern US, where he's overseeing Concern US involvement in a series of programs designed to improve global humanitarian coordination and response. And many of you may be familiar already with the Building a Better Response project with which he's been very much involved. Also, like to give a warm welcome to Paul Knox Clark. Paul is bringing extensive experience in organizational effectiveness and international organizations. He's currently leading ALNAP's program of research, looking particularly in his own research at issues of leadership, coordination, evidence and decision-making, as well as organizational and systemic change.
And our third speaker today will be Mohamed Kilani, who is the Director of Planning, Coordination and Program at the Jordan Hashemite Charity Organization, JHCO, which is an NGO based in Jordan that provides direct humanitarian aid to affected people during and after both conflict and natural disasters. With the onset of the Syrian crisis, JHCO has turned its focus inwards and has contributed substantially to the early relief effort to serve Syrian refugees. It functions as a coordinating force for international aid organizations operating in Jordan as the liaison with the Jordanian government. And our last speaker of today's session will be Najat Rojdi, who is currently serving as the Deputy Special Representative of the UN Secretary General, the SRSG, Humanitarian Coordinator, United Nations Resident Coordinator, and UNDP Resident Representative in the Central African Republic. Prior to her tenure with the United Nations, she held senior level positions in the American government. She has an extensive experience in both development and humanitarian affairs.
Great, and wonderful to have all of you with us for today's event. We're going to begin by giving the floor to Kirk for a presentation really setting the stage here and drawing from some of the work that I think has been incorporated also in the BBR. So a very good early morning to you, Kirk. Great to have you with us again. I'm giving the floor over to you.
Great, thanks so much for that warm introduction, and Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. I think I saw someone calling in from the West Coast of the U.S., so it's even earlier there. So thanks for your commitment to learning about coordination and talking about it. So I've been tasked with the very difficult job of trying to go over the complete basics of humanitarian coordination at the country and regional level in all of 15 minutes. So we are going to go through this rather quickly. It's going to be a very kind of top-level look at it, but I encourage everyone, if they want to know more information, there's lots of resources out there. You can go to buildingabetterresponse.org to take a free online learning that's been developed by Concern Worldwide, my organization, International Medical Corps, and Harvard. With support of USAID, but there's also other things out there on OCHA's website, on ICVA's website. There's lots of information out there. The other kind of disclaimer I wanted to give at the start is what I'm going to be presenting over the next 15 minutes is kind of the ideal situation, you know, like how it looks in theory. What a lot of you all will see in your own countries will be slightly different. You know, it is a little flexible. Things change depending on countries, depending on who's in charge. So perhaps that's actually hopefully one of the things we're going to get to with our discussion and our questions as well, is to talk about how this works in individual countries as well. So again, I'm just presenting the theoretical aspect of how it's supposed to work. Okay, so those being said, I wanted to start off with a little bit of history actually about it, because the system we've been using has actually been around for a little while. And it started way back in the early 2000s. Actually, it started before then, but many of the systems we talk about and the terms we talk about came about in the early 2000s. And it was in large part response to the crisis in Darfur. So as many of you would know, back in the early 2000s, there was a major humanitarian emergency in Darfur. And there were issues with the humanitarian response. It didn't go as well as it should have, and as a result, people didn't get the services that they needed to. So there was a response review commissioned and undertaken in 2005, and this review highlighted a bunch of problems and issues within the response. It's actually still available. It's 130 pages, I think, if you want, so it's a little on the lengthy side. But it is it's a kind of a key tenet of humanitarian reform. And within this review, it identified that there were long-standing gaps within the Darfur response. You know, so certain areas got much more attention and services than other areas. And there was also unpredictable capacity. You know, agencies would come in and leave, staff would come in and leave, and response would swell and decrease without much, you know, without much thought. This kind of gave it an ad hoc nature to the response, which meant it wasn't particularly strategic as well. You know, all the actors weren't acting towards the same strategic goals. They weren't all striving towards the same areas. One of the reasons for this was that there was largely only erratic coordination. It wasn't systematized. You know, coordination was mostly done based on who you knew and who you happened to be working with, but it wasn't systematic. There were weak partnerships with the local level, with national actors, affected populations, local government, local CBOs. And a big one was their insufficient accountability among humanitarian agencies. I think this was really important. Agencies would kind of say they would do one thing and not necessarily follow through with it on all accounts. And this is obviously very bad for the humanitarian response and for the affected population. And then the final one was that donor policies were inconsistent, depending on the donor and depending on the situation. So, I mean, obviously not exactly a great review of a large-scale humanitarian response. So there were several key things that came out that they tried to change as a result of this. And this was kind of the pillars of humanitarian reform. And these 4 pillars tried to deal with all those things that were identified within the Darfur review. The first one was coordination. It really was trying to get at that concept of how to make coordination more systematic. And from this, something called the cluster approach was first introduced. It was first rolled out for the most part in Uganda, I think, actually in 2006. But it was based on the existing kind of sector approach. And again, if these terms aren't familiar to some of you, don't worry, we're going to be going through with them all shortly. There was also the concept of leadership. From the Darfur review, they kind of had this concept that no one was really in charge. There was no ultimate accountability figure. So they came up with the position of Humanitarian Coordinator, who again we'll get to shortly. Financing, the funds and mechanisms for rapid response weren't there. It took way too long for agencies to get the funding and the donor support they needed to scale up quickly in the areas they needed to, so we tried to address that. And then finally, partnership, which is the concept of working together towards a common goal across all actors, from the smallest local CBO all the way up to the biggest UN agency. And all of this, as you can kind of see in that graphic on the right, was founded on the concept of engaging with the country system. So it really is a country-based system. Okay. So that is kind of the history of coordination in a nutshell. And so now we're going to go through some of those terms that I pointed out there as well. And the first thing is that we always hear about, and one of those the key tenets of that humanitarian reform is this concept of a cluster. And I always ask, and sometimes we have the problem of making it a little bit more complicated than it has to be. So the very simple, what is a cluster? All a cluster essentially is you have your affected populations. These are the people that are affected by a crisis that us as humanitarians, whether it's Concerned Worldwide or your own organization, are responding to. And you have all those people that are trying to help out and trying to respond to those affected populations' needs. First and foremost is always family, friends, and neighbors. I always like to highlight that because those are almost always the first responders to a humanitarian emergency. There's the government, and then you have all of these other, NGOs and civil society organizations, Concern, Oxfam, Mercy Malaysia, you insert your name here. And all a cluster is a group of organizations working in the same sector or area. And by sector or area, I don't mean geographic, I mean in terms of type of programming. So for example, health or WASH or, shelter. So all it is this grouping of NGOs, civil society organizations, and other actors that are working in that same area. And it's organized by the sector. And the sectors we have 11 of them actually. I won't quiz you all at this early hour in the morning, but a lot of you are probably familiar with them. You can see them all here: shelter, protection, nutrition, logistics, health, food security, telecom, education, early recovery, camp management, and WASH. So those are our 11 sectors that are all organized together. But my question always comes back to, yeah, that's great, and everything is good to organize by sector, but what do they actually do? And the key thing was clusters were organized to achieve certain tangible benefits, to try to improve those humanitarian response. And the guidance on clusters, again, it's available online. The online cluster reference module, I think, is the official term for it. But they've been organized into 6 key functions, as they refer to them. The first, and some would probably argue is the most important, is to support service delivery. So the key goal of a cluster is to support the delivery of services to affected populations. And they do this through a variety of means. They want to make sure that everyone working within those clusters is driven to the same strategic priorities. So you want to make sure that you're, going towards the same goals to help the same, affected population. They also do a lot to develop the coordination mechanisms to avoid those duplication and, more importantly, also to avoid gaps, to prevent gaps in programming. So a lot of you are probably familiar with the 4 W's: who, what, when, where, which is what organizations use and fill out. It can be as simple as a easy Excel sheet that the cluster will circulate, to an online tool. There's different ways of doing it depending on your country. And this really lays out who is doing what where within the country. And you can use this to coordinate your response and make sure there's no gaps and duplication. It also links with other clusters. I think we would all agree, that a WASH response is going to be very linked to nutrition, and shelter and livelihoods often go together. So we don't want to view these as silos. They need to work together. So the clusters should link together. There should also be an element of capacity building within this as well. So that's the first of the 6 cluster functions. Supporting service delivery, that's a lot of what you all might have seen in your on-the-ground aspect, especially with the 4 W's and some of these other ones. The second one is to inform HC/HCT decision-making. And we'll get to those acronyms in a second. But a lot of this revolves around the concept of needs assessments and response gaps analysis across and within sectors. So if some of you might have in your own countries come across, multi-sector rapid assessments, this would be where the clusters feed into them within their own sectors. What's going on within, WASH within Nepal? This would be what's the needs there? What do we need to get done? Where are the gaps? And how do we cross-cut issues such as age and gender and the environment and HIV/AIDS in there? And that from these needs assessments, we can make sure that the priorities are grounded, We want to make sure that what we're doing as a cluster, as an NGO, is really what needs to be done to respond best to the humanitarian emergency. The third one is about planning and implementation. So a lot based on those needs assessments that we were talking about. The cluster will come up with specific plans, objectives, and indicators. And a lot of this comes back to that concept of accountability. And within that accountability, you can't be accountable if you don't have, a sector plan. You can't be accountable if you don't have an objective. So this will be, and especially indicators. So this will allow us to have indicators to guide the response and make sure we're actually achieving what we said we were doing. We would, the shelter cluster in one small area in South Sudan would try to design, 10,000 temporary shelters. And we can see if we're actually doing this. And it also will then go into kind of clarifying funding requirements as well. See how much money we need to actually achieve these indicators. Fourth one is M&E. I'm sure I have some M&E people on the line here, so they'll be glad to see this one. And it's all about the monitoring and reporting on activities and needs. And this will be where we measure the progress of those indicators and recommend corrective action. I really like that last one because the key thing about M&E is you don't just do it for fun. You want to make sure that it's doing it so that you can improve the response and change things that aren't going well. This one is about build national capacity and preparedness and contingency planning. So it's pretty much as it says, to build the capacity going forward. And within this, the last little kind of point in blue there is every cluster is responsible for integrating early recovery in the beginning. And that's really that transition away from emergency response. We want to start thinking about the recovery aspect as soon as possible. It's not always easy to do in every response, but it's something that we should be striving for ultimately. And then the final and sixth one is support robust advocacy. And this is about identifying concerns and contributing key information and messages to the HC and HCT. And I actually think it's one of the things the clusters do fairly well in some of my own personal experiences. And it can actually really help an NGO, because if you're an NGO, you might not feel comfortable speaking out against the government in an area you're working, or against the donor, that you might be working with. So you can use the clusters to kind of advocate on your behalf and to do shared advocacy. Messages are much stronger coming from a large group, so we, the 120 members of the shelter cluster, think this sounds a lot better than just me concerned needs this, or seeing this. So and combining that with the fact that it allows you to have sometimes a degree of anonymity, I think it really is important and sometimes helps out a lot. So those in a very quick thing are the 6 cluster functions, but there's some other key actors that we want to talk about to understand the basics. There's something called the HC, there's also the HCT, which I've referred to already, cluster coordinators, technical working groups, strategic working groups, and regional coordination. Now, 2 of the ones that I touched on right away because they deal directly within the clusters are the technical working group and the strategic working group. The technical working group, sometimes called a TWIG, is all about designing the technical guidance within that cluster. So clusters can sometimes be very large, and I've been in ones that had 200 people, So if you're going to be coming up with technical standards and things like that, you might need a smaller group of experts. So within let's say the shelter cluster, the technical working group might meet together to come up with the agreed upon standards for rehabilitation of earthquake damaged structures. A technical working group in nutrition might design the necessary caloric intake for nutrition intervention. These are things that a technical working group might work on. It's all about making sure it's context and country specific, and that it's meeting those technical needs and minimum standards that the sector kind of identifies. The other smaller group within a cluster is called the strategic working group, and this sets the strategy for the cluster. And again, it's trying to get a smaller group of dedicated individuals to work on these areas to set the strategy within the cluster. These are open to NGOs, and I wholeheartedly encourage NGOs to participate and take active leadership roles in them, and they can really help influence the response. It's one of the I would argue, one of the best and easiest ways for NGOs, national NGOs, local NGOs to get involved and make sure that the response is meeting the needs that they are seeing on the ground. Us as NGOs often are, the eyes and ears on the ground, so we need to make sure that the response is being coordinated in a way that reflects. A few of these other terms. One is the Humanitarian Coordinator, the HC. And the Humanitarian Coordinator is that essentially leader of the humanitarian response. For lack of a better term, it's kind of like how I talked in the first workshop about the boss. It's more or less the boss of the humanitarian response. It's the top UN official within the response, and they define the scenario, they prioritize, plan, and assess, They're responsible for all the coordination mechanisms, they do advocacy, they lead the response, they lead the funding strategy, they're supposed to help facilitate humanitarian access, and importantly, they're also supposed to help ensure that humanitarian laws, principles, and standards are met by all the agencies. So it's a huge portfolio of work. I'm sure many of you, I saw many of the countries coming in on the left here, have HCTs within your own country. And they're essentially the boss of the humanitarian response, and they're one of the key links with the government. But of course, because this is such a wide scope of work, there's no way that one person or one office could do this. So there's also something called the Humanitarian Country Team, which is essentially the HC team to help out with all those various things. And here's what they do: they work to establish those clusters and which ones are developed, develop the strategy and plans, resource allocation, common policies, principles, etc. It's very similar to the HC's roles. It's chaired by the HC, so the HC chairs the response. And again, it's just helping out to do that massive undertaking of leading a humanitarian response. Now, who's on the HCT? The HCT can be made up of UN agencies. Well, IOM actually is now part of NGOs, the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. And the only criteria, so people often ask me, like, what do you have to do to be on an HCT? You have to be operationally relevant, which basically just means that you have to be operational in the country on humanitarian programming. You have to be doing humanitarian response in the country. And just like technical working groups, HCTs can be good examples of good areas where NGOs can get involved. Concern's been on numerous ones throughout its history, and they really allow you to, get your input in there and represent other NGOs as well. That's the big thing about the HCT is you're not supposed to be representing your own NGO. You're supposed to be representing the broader body and the humanitarian response at large. So it's a good opportunity for NGOs to get in there. Every HCT has NGOs on it. Some are primarily NGOs, some are lesser so. But I really recommend getting involved with this. And then there's also something called the cluster coordinator, and since I'm running short on time, it supports the cluster functioning. You can't have that cluster, based on a volunteer system. It really needs someone to ensure that it's all working well and the admin aspects of it, and this is what the cluster coordinator does. All those information management tools you see come out of it, the pretty maps and graphs and all the documents and stuff will also be coordinated by the cluster coordinator. So it's an important role within each cluster in the country. And then here is one of my final slides is the map of the current active clusters. The clusters are in red, so in the sectors, which is kind of a more informal aspect of it, or which we didn't even touch on the concept of refugees as well. But the red is what we want to focus on here, which is all the active clusters. I believe there's 26, but I'm totally, for some reason, I feel like that might not be accurate. I'm sure one of my colleagues can chime in on the left with exactly how many active clusters there are now. But as you can see, they're in most of the main humanitarian hotspots out there. Somalia, obviously, Ethiopia, Yemen, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Colombia, and some of these other ones as well. And there's also, as we saw there's something that we want to touch on briefly, which we talked about a little bit more, is this concept of regional coordination. And what regional coordination gets to is this idea that in many of those countries that you see on this PHAP slide, they involve more than one country. So for example, the Syria response, there's a response in Turkey, there's a response in Iraq, there's a response in Jordan, there's people responding in Lebanon. It really is a regional, crisis. So as a response to that, they try to set up a regional response mechanism for coordination. In these cases, instead of having an Humanitarian Coordinator, you'll also have a regional coordinator who will be responsible for the regional coordination, the boss of essentially of regional coordination. And to try to make sure that the response is integrated across the countries so that geographic boundaries don't, hinder their response. It's a relatively new kind of phenomenon. I think it happened for the first time in 2015, I want to say. So it's not as old as the clusters, but I think it's a good one, and it's moving forward. The Sahel is another example of it. So that band across kind of northern Africa, which often has similar needs and is susceptible to similar weather disturbances and whatnot, is often treated as one kind of regional coordination mechanism as well. All right, and then finishing up, as you saw from that map, clusters aren't everywhere, and they're not even in every humanitarian emergency. So why are they? What happens to be a cluster activated? And the key activities are that there has to be a new large-scale emergency or sudden deterioration in an ongoing emergency, which causes gaps. And each part of that is really important. So it's either new, so it's like a sudden onset earthquake or flooding or tsunami, or it could be a situation gets much worse. You had a low-level conflict that disintegrates into full-on war. And there has to be, the other aspect of that, the second part of that sentence is causing gaps. There has to be a gap in services that requires clusters. The second part of cluster activation is that the national coordination or response capacity is unable to meet the needs due to the scale, the number of actors involved, the kind of multi-sector complex aspect of it, or other constraints. That's the thing, that if the country is able to meet the coordination and response needs on its own, you probably won't have the clusters activated within that. How do they actually get activated? Some of this I'll touch back on some of those things we did in the first session back about a month ago, but the country level recommends them. So the head of the cluster, the HC, there's a term RC in here as well, that stands for a regional coordinator, who might be the head development agency in a non-emergency setting, and something called the cluster lead agencies consult with the government on the capacity. So it's done in conjunction with the government. The government is ultimately has the final say in which clusters are activated, so it's really important to be working within the government as well. And the global cluster leads then inform the humanitarian country team about what they're recommending, and they essentially then just recommend this up the ladder to the UN at the global level. So that's something called the ERC, Emergency Relief Coordinator, who we talked about, as I said, in that last session we did back in May. And then based on this, the global level kind of decides. The emergency, the ERC shares these recommendations with their team, which is called the ISC, and they're supposed to approve this within 24 hours. And then within that, they just kind of confirm it, and then the clusters are more or less activated within them. On a similar aspect, clusters are supposed to be temporary. That's a key aspect of it. They're not supposed to be there for, there's some people in some countries like DRC and some of these others that have had clusters for 10, 12, 13 years, and my question is, but they really are supposed to be deactivated when they're no longer needed. And so as a result of that, there's a process for this. And it really is about that they're supposed to be reviewed by the humanitarian coordinator and his or her team. And in a sudden onset emergency, they're supposed to be reviewed every 3 months. In a protracted emergency, it's usually closer to every year. And it's supposed to be led by the HC with the HCT and national authority. And again, it's based on national capacity. So it's supposed to look at how the national capacity is going and if they are uptake and if there's ability for the national actors to take over. It takes into account of the context, and it's guided by early recovery and resilience building. The final But the last thing I want to touch on is that everything we've talked about is supposed to link to that country strategy. So this gets back to that very first part about humanitarian reform and the fact that it wasn't, guided towards shared principles and shared strategy. Now there is essentially a shared strategy. And this is part of something called the humanitarian program cycle. This is a screenshot I grabbed from our e-learning tool, so that's a little bit of self-promotion there. But you can learn all about the possible aspects of the humanitarian program cycle within that. And the one I want to focus on is the strategic response planning aspect of it. And what this is the strategic response planning is two different kinds of ways that the humanitarian community comes together to guide the humanitarian response and to come up with those indicators, those cluster-specific goals and activities and funding needs. The first one is the flash appeal. This has gone through several names. I'm hoping it's still called the flash appeal. It was formerly called the preliminary response plan for a little bit, and before that it was the flash appeal again. So we're back to where we started. And this is for essentially sudden onset emergencies. That's where I've mostly seen it used, but it can also be used when there's a spike or change in a protracted emergency. And it's a short document that's issued 3 to 5 days after a sudden onset emergency. So the one on the right there was after that earthquake in Ecuador about a year ago. What is needed? What's the key strategies driving this on a very kind of quick aspect of it? And here's the purposes of it. It's meant to outline the immediate priority actions and initial funding estimate mostly. And again, the key thing about this is because it's done within 3 to 5 days. One of the aspects of it is how are we going to scale up, and what are the main risks and response to the humanitarian response? What risks do we have in this sudden onset or protracted crisis that has a spike? It's done with the HCT and OCHA, and all the clusters feed in, and again, it uses the 4 Ws. So that matrix we talked about coordination feeds into this. The second one, which a lot of you I assume are familiar with or have seen in your own countries, is something called a humanitarian response plan. This also has had several names. I've seen it called strategic response plans. I've seen it called specific country response plans. So like the Somalia response plan. But all it is it's like the flash appeal, but it's more detailed, and it's meant to cover a wider array of topics and areas. It's issued 30 days after after the flash appeal in sudden onset emergencies. So after the flash appeal, it builds upon that. It makes it more detailed and hopefully a little better, for lack of a better word. And in protracted emergencies, it's issued annually and it's updated annually, usually in the last quarter of every of the year, so around December. But it's meant to be timed with the need. So, for example, the Hell one I think is released in I believe February or so, because that's when they have better information on the weather patterns. So that's when it's best to use it. And I see on the left there that Liz is pointing out a link where you can get all the flash appeals and humanitarian response plans. So I strongly encourage you to go to those links and put it in your own countries or the countries you're interested in to see them. And the purpose of this is like the flash appeal and like everything we've been talking about. This is why I wanted to highlight it. It links into all of it. It's all about developing the strategic objectives, the cluster objectives, and contributions, those indicators and targets, and how are we going to link this all to existing development plans and recovery. It's a management tool. That's a key aspect of it. It's really trying to see how we can better manage the humanitarian response. Its structure is its top-line strategy. So it's what are the top line, what's the overall country-based, kind of objectives, and then it goes into the more detailed cluster response aspects of it. So each active cluster will have a small little section within this. So it kind of goes over the overall country response and then the cluster-specific ones. It utilizes something called the MIRA and the HNO. These are just two acronyms for joint needs assessments that we talked about earlier. So these are those needs assessments that clusters will do as well, and it utilizes the data from that to hopefully make sure that's accurate. So on the right there, you can see the 2016 Humanitarian Response Plan for Bangladesh. And it has those key top-line things, 3.7 people, affected. This one is, and it requires $13 million in humanitarian funding, hopefully. And if you actually were able to read or pulled it up, you could see the background of it, the strategic objectives. It's kind of blurry there. Those are those objectives for the humanitarian response at the bottom. And so this guides that humanitarian response and has an aspect of accountability as well. So I'm sorry this time I was a little over 15 minutes, guys, but that in a short period is the very, very basics of kind of country and regional level coordination. I look forward to talking a lot more about this over the next 90 minutes. And yeah, that was, I hope you got a lot out of that. If you need more information, we'll talk about it here, and there's also plenty of resources online.
Thank you so much, Kirk. I'm sure that it has clarified a lot of issues for many of the participants. Before we move to the next speaker, I would like to ask you a question that comes from Willian in the Netherlands, and would like to know more about the selection of cluster leads. She asked about how cluster leads are chosen and who does it. Personally, I would also extend it to the co-lead of the cluster, if you could explain a bit more on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So cluster lead agencies are essentially, so each of those clusters that is activated will have an agency who is more or less in charge of the running of the cluster and is in charge of making sure that the fellow agencies in that are being held accountable and that everything is getting done as it should be getting done. Often the cluster lead agencies correspond with the global cluster lead. So if you're on in the last month's presentation, there's these global cluster leads, and these are the agencies that are in charge of the clusters at the global level. And often in countries, they sync up with that. So for example, WFP is often the cluster lead agency for the food security cluster. That being said, that's not always the case. They're chosen in country, and with when a cluster is activated in a country at the global level, they decide who is the cluster lead agency. So that's where they decide who it is, to answer that question. So there's IASC principles, and the ERC and the HC and the HCT decides who's going to be the cluster lead agency. As I said, it's often that head UN agency for the most part, but as was alluded to, there's also something called cluster co-lead. And this is when, a second agency will lead will join with the cluster lead to lead the agency. And a lot of times this is where NGOs can come in. So the most useful example is Save the Children is often the cluster co-lead of the education cluster. And again, this is decided on a country-by-country basis. Another key aspect to throw in there is that governments sometimes have a lead agency in there as well. So, the Ministry of Health might be a cluster co-lead in some countries. But again, it's determined at the country level and signed off on / agreed upon at the global level by those kind of head people. Did that answer it, you think?
think that's perfect. I'll jump in here. Thanks so much. I think it really did clarify a lot, and it is a really interesting question. So glad that that came through. We're going to move on now. I'd like to pass the floor over to Paul Knox-Clark, again, Head of Research with ALNAP, to walk us through some thoughts on how we can improve humanitarian coordination at the country level. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much, and hi everybody. It's an incredible group here around globally, so it's lovely to be speaking to you this morning, or at least this morning where I am. I was asked to give a short answer to a difficult question around improving the coordination system that Kirk just ably outlined, and I'll try to do that, or give some thoughts anyhow fairly briefly. The thoughts are based on quite a lot of work that we at ALNAP have done, which is available to all of you. If you go to the ALNAP website, you'll find these reports under the Leadership and Coordination section. They look like the two reports on the right hand of the slide here. We did a lot of literature review with a lot of interviews, meetings with the global clusters, and we had a large expert meeting last year as well, and that's really where these thoughts are coming from. So overall, how is the coordination system doing? Well, I think the first point to make is that coordination is a difficult job. And if we're looking for perfection in coordination in these very complicated contexts with limited information and many actors, we probably won't find it. And that's not necessarily a reflection on the humanitarian system, because this is also a conclusion that has been come to by people looking at interagency coordination in civil defense mechanisms in, for example, Australia and North America. So you can do coordination, but you probably can never do it perfectly. You need to be trying to do it as well as you can. The second thing that I think is important to note is that any generalization about the clusters and the coordination system as a whole is bound to be incorrect in specific cases. As Kirk alluded to, there's so many different things going on in so many different places that you'll always find exceptions and examples. So everything I say here is a general point, but probably in specific circumstances they would not necessarily hold in all places. So overall, anyway, with those two caveats, all of the evidence that we have been able to access points to the fact that the current coordination system is pretty good at enhancing, in most cases, enhancing operational coordination. That's the gaps and overlaps piece that Kirk was speaking about, that the clusters do. It's trying to make sure that you don't have two organizations doing the same thing in the same place, or areas that are completely underserved because organizations are not aware that there are gaps in service provision. So essentially, you might say as well that suggests that the bit of the coordination mechanism that is working best is the cluster part. And that seems to be the case. The operational coordination, which is largely the function of the clusters, seems to be more effective than some of the jobs done by subnational coordination, inter-cluster coordination, and the Humanitarian Country Team. And I think that's reflected by the fact that overall the literature and interviews suggest that whilst the operational ground-level coordination is okay, the high-level country strategic response-wide coordination is less good. So what can be done to improve coordination? There's three broad areas I'd like to introduce to you, see what you think about. First of all, something that came through loud and clear to us is that there are many different understandings of what coordination actually means. And that's a problem if you're trying to do it well. Particularly, over time, coordination has moved from being trying to get different autonomous organizations who are independent to work more effectively with one another. And it's become more a situation of trying to get all of these agencies to follow one single plan, all of these autonomous agencies to fit into a single, rather top-down plan. And it doesn't seem to work. This idea of coordination, which is really coordination as control, many people would like to see it work, but we were not able to find a single situation where it was actually working. There are also questions, not only does it not work, there are also questions about whether it is the right approach to doing coordination in complex, very rapidly changing situations. Because in those situations, if everybody is trying to follow a big plan, that big plan is quite slow to produce, and it's slow to change. Whereas if people are more loosely coordinating with one another at the field level, coordination is quicker and potentially more responsive to field level concerns. So generally, a clarification around coordination, clarification that coordination is more about coordinating with one another and less about being coordinated, seemed to be a key theme of the research that we did, and some practical steps to move in that direction. Going back to what Kirk was saying, a lot of this centralized top-down coordination is a result of the way the humanitarian program cycle process and the HRP have evolved, and it could be time for a rethink about that, to try and create HPCs that are more designed from the activities on the ground and less top-down design. Maybe we'll talk about that later. Focusing the HCTs more on the strategic issues, focusing more on what's really going on and what the real opportunities and threats to the response are, and less on the process of creating these documents would improve coordination. Clarifying the needs for information that operational agencies have and focusing the information management that's done on those needs and less perhaps on creating the strategic plan for financial purposes, so that the information that's flowing is flowing to support immediate response. And finally, strengthening the intercluster function. The intercluster function is really important because it's the place where, it's the bit where the sectoral information and sectoral decisions come together before they get to the HCT. And it's often not very well resourced, and a focus on that area could significantly improve coordination. On to the second big bucket, context. I mean, this will not come as a surprise to anyone, but whilst the cluster guidance, the cluster reference model, the HCT terms of reference and so on, talk about the importance of context, what has tended to happen is a general move to putting a one-size-fits-all, 11 clusters, same model of coordination everywhere, irrespective of what's actually there already, irrespective of what the needs are. And really what's needed here is a rethink to build on and support existing coordination systems rather than just pushing them aside. So what would that need? That would need mapping out coordination structures in advance, contingency planning, working with the government, working with national coordination, civil society coordination bodies to see what's there and to see whether there are any gaps that the international system needs to fill. It would mean changing the incentive structures. At the moment, the cluster lead agencies receive finance for instituting the clusters when the clusters have to be instituted. And maybe that means that, there is an incentive to always do the same thing and not to kind of change it to the country context. And thirdly, building a context-relevant architecture is more complicated than just taking the one out of the playbook. And HCTs should be supported with the pretty basic skills that are required to do that analysis and design. And then finally, the third big area for improving coordination, we feel would be inclusion. And this builds on the last piece, but it's actively engaging with the state and with civil society. Now, what does that mean in practice? And many of you have been asking questions about this because many of you, I think, have your own experiences both of this working and of it not working as well as it should. I mean, there's some just practical constraints that prevent national civil society in particular participating. The language of meetings, the location of meetings, often a long way from the operation of the clusters, and the use of ICT, which many agencies don't have the right sort of ICT equipment, can't afford the right ICT equipment. So all of these things at a country level really need to be thought out. What is stopping people engaging. And the clusters and the architecture needs to ameliorate that situation. I think the second thing that we saw is that there are a lot of excellent civil society actors in particular who really aren't particularly interested in the coordination mechanisms. This is a bit of a two-way street, and I think the coordination mechanisms need to, the IASC OCHA-based coordination mechanisms, need to be much clearer about the value of and make this value clear to civil society organizations and national NGOs in particular, so that they can make an informed choice as to whether to commit their time to doing this. And then thirdly, and there were some questions about this, there are often many organizations, and it's very difficult to get decisions made with these very large groups. Now, to a degree, the twigs and the strategic working groups address this, but another way of addressing this is to, at the HCT level and the cluster level, is to work with national NGO network, rather than with 40 or 50 organizations, to work with a network and to support and empower that network, maybe to fund that network. Because there's some great networks out there. I'm sure many of you are part of these. And that is a way that the national voice can be included. I think there's a lot more on this, and I'm sure we're going to talk about it in a minute. So I will say no more, thank you for listening. If you want to see more on this, do go to the documentation which is available, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paul. Indeed, we have a lot of questions, and we'll deal with some of them in the Q&A later. But for now, I would like to go back on a question that Tyler from Canada has raised, a very academic question, asking if you can drive us a bit through the inherent tensions in between being more effective and more inclusive.
Yeah, it is a very good question. I mean, it's interesting that at the cluster level, there is a tension not only between inclusiveness and effectiveness, but I'd actually broaden the question between inclusiveness, effectiveness, and capacity building to make people effective, make organizations more effective. And as Kirk pointed out, all three of those things are in the cluster reference manual. So the clusters are expected to be able to make good, difficult decisions quickly, but with almost infinite numbers of organizations, or very large numbers of organizations in some cases, while they are also building the capacity of other organizations. And it's a big art. To a degree, I think the tension between the first and second parts can and has been very effectively dealt with by strategic working groups. So where you have a large group for consultation and then a smaller group that's actually making the decisions and then taking those back to the larger group. That allows both the inclusion and the effective decision making to occur. I'm not sure about the capacity building piece. I have a sense that capacity building is perhaps before the World Humanitarian Summit was being kind of swept under the carpet a little bit. Now it's a much more front and center of the international humanitarian system, and maybe as such it should be being done not inside a coordination mechanism, but there is the energy and the resource to do that in another place, in other fora instead, and to leave the coordination system to do coordination. But I'd be very interested to hear thoughts from participants as well on how, if they have ideas about how this tension has been addressed in their context, because I don't think there's an answer. I think it's one of those things where trying to separate out the functions will take you a certain degree, and also delegation, so this use of NGO network to represent will take you a certain degree. This is why we have representative government in our countries, because not everybody can make every decision.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Paul. Really an excellent presentation and a really thought-provoking response to a difficult but important question. We're going to move to our next presentation. We're really honored to have a bit of time from Deputy SRSG in Central African Republic. Najat Roshdi is joining us now on the line, and very happy to give you the floor. Over to you.
Hello. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share how we are coordinating in CAR, and I will try to stick to the time because I know that we will have to finish at 11. In CER, in Central African Republic, the humanitarian coordination mechanism we have are obviously at the strategic decision making, the HCT, Then in terms of interaction and coordination with the armed force, we have the SIM Corps. In terms of response implementation, the intercluster. And of course, at the regional level and the local level, we have the general coordination, the ICC and the subclusters, and all of those mechanisms supported by a very good and efficient information management working group and a communication group with the working group. We have clusters, and we are sharing information about the humanitarian situation and response, as well as important development and political and security levels at the humanitarian forum. But beside that, there are also other mechanisms which actually are allowing OCHA mainly and ICRT to participate also to the security management teams organized for UNCT and for the mission, the peacekeeping mission, so we can also share there and discuss together a number of security issues. And last but not least, there is also a mechanism which helps a lot the coordination when it comes to protection, which is a senior management group where we are discussing coordination of protection of civilian issues. In terms of the HCT and membership of the HCT, we have international NGOs coordination forum, which is a dedicated coordination team with 13 international staff and 49 NGOs, and which happen to be a very, very, very important and critical actually platform in the discussion, in the response and in the coordination. We have also the INSO, the International NGO Security Forum. The HCT has 3 representatives from international NGOs, 1 representative from the national NGOs, and the International NGO Coordination Forum, the CCO. In terms of clusters, the international NGOs and the national NGOs are members of the clusters, and in the interclusters, NGOs are co-facilitator of 5 clusters: food security, nutrition, health, protection, and WASH. And within the civil mill coordination cell, we have 2 international NGOs representatives, and the International NGOs Coordination Forum and INSO. And in terms of communication with communities working group, we have the participation and the representation of 5 to 8 NGOs. And finally, information management working group, we have 3 to 4 NGOs. When it comes to the challenges faced by the national NGOs, well, you know, in Central African Republic, we are faced with almost absence of the state and of the authorities outside of Bangui and outside of 2 or 3 cities like Bambari and others. So this absence and weakness of national and local authorities is a big issue that we are in, a big challenge we are facing, but is mainly faced by the national NGOs. On the other hand, the multiplicity of national NGOs actors with differences in mandate, programming, resources, modus operandi, presence in the country, but sometimes even in terms of real knowledge about the humanitarian operation, the humanitarian principles, and the humanitarian intervention is also a big challenge, which is putting even more emphasis on the need actually to focus on building capacities of the national NGOs. The participation in humanitarian coordination mechanism requires also resources, obviously, in terms of personnel, in terms of logistics, in terms of time, and a certain level of organizational internal coordination and somehow professionalism, which actually will help provide accurate and up-to-date information to a local representative to make decisions and not just attend. And unfortunately, most of the time they are lacking those resources, and therefore this is really jeopardizing the efficiency of their participation and their contribution. The national NGOs are playing a coordination role, but nevertheless, this is requiring skilled and experienced staff in coordination, in funding, and in resource mobilization, which most of the time is lacking here. There is also a very high turnover of staff, including at cluster lead and co-lead level. Search staff are staying only for short periods, which is really immediately leading to a very low institutional memory, but also a difficulty in having a kind of continuity in the leadership style, but also in the relationship built and how actually we can capitalize on this relationship capital within the clusters themselves. Part of the coordination mechanism challenges, it's also, well, there is a mistake here. It's really insufficient inclusion of national NGOs, not international NGOs, because they are very well represented in the HCT, in CAR at least. But I have to say that I have seen in other countries I served as an HC, that there was sometimes a lack of representation, mainly when there is no clear platform of coordination of the NGOs themselves, whether for the international NGOs or the national NGOs, and therefore it's become really a fight who is going to sit on the HCT. While if they are very structured, well organized and recognized coordination platforms of international NGOs and national NGOs, those become really the interface for the HC and for all the members to come up with a clear representation that is accepted by all the international NGOs and the NGOs. Second, here in CAR in particular, because of all the ethnic conflicts and fights going on, it is the NGOs are very much politicized and polarized as well, which obviously is a problem and is an issue when it comes to our neutrality and our impartiality as humanitarian. I already mentioned before the challenge of inclusion and representation versus having a manageable size for effective coordination and decision making, and we are really faced with that, where some national NGOs, just because they have a very strong voice, might end up participating, but at the same time they don't have a manageable size or enough size for them to be effective at the operational point of view. The spread of humanitarian needs and multiplication of hotspots and a new outbreak of violence is really requiring coordination at subnational and local level as really key for the effectiveness of our response, and making sure actually that the coordination is also happening in a very efficient, responsive and appropriate way at the local level and at the subnational level, while there are linkages with the national level. The articulation in CAR, there is a very important dimension which actually is directly linked to the new way of working together and all what came out from the Humanitarian Summit. There is a huge need and a very important need to have a clear articulation between the recovery and development coordination with, of course, the humanitarian, which is another layer of coordination, and therefore calling on additional presence and participation, but also additional coordination with the humanitarian, but also sometimes a way, of course, for us to have a mindset shift, but also a new way of addressing humanitarian response. It's also adding to the pressure and to the workload on the clusters, some clusters in particular, and one challenge is definitely to make sure that we still have dedicated people and full-time cluster leaders, and that we avoid to have different dashboards coming out and different information, but rather really a kind of aggregated data and joint analysis and joint mapping and obviously common understanding of the challenges. The cluster co-facilitation is a very important mechanism and approach to help this joint understanding and aggregation of data and this joint analysis as well, but it is also a very good opportunity for funding through the humanitarian funds as well, which is also a very important mechanism actually to provide funding to the national NGOs and to the international NGOs as well. It is helping us to promote and strengthen the shared analysis, as I said before, but more importantly to have a joint understanding of the context and to come up with a clear and shared and committed response from everybody. It is again very important to develop more the interaction with national NGOs, and as an HC I have been sharing that with the HCT on a regular basis and asking and calling on the international NGOs, on the UN agencies to really allocate resources and time to build the capacities of the national NGOs. They are very much present in the field, but it is also important that they are involved, because somehow it's also a very good interface and a very good liaison with the local communities, because most of the time they are speaking only the local language, and therefore we need to capitalize on their knowledge, on their local knowledge, and their also positioning with the local communities. I cannot put enough emphasis on the mobility and the subnational coordination mechanism, through setting of hubs of mobile antennas, especially in CAR where we have outbreak of violence and where we need immediate response, and therefore we just cannot afford just to have everything happening in Bangui and everything going through Bangui, because this is taking much more time, and we have been faced with that situation already during the last outbreak of violence in the southeast. So strengthening and multiplying those hubs, which obviously is going to call on additional resources, and it is going to call on either in terms of staffing or in terms of funding. Keeping in mind that obviously this needs to be done in a full coordination between the national and the sub-national levels. Finally, I would like to also mention that actually the new term of reference of the HCTs and this compact between the HC and the different members of the HCT is a promising move and a promising shift, helping us most probably to get a better accountability, but also to get a better efficiency and a better coordination within the HCT compared to the situation we had before. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Najat, for sharing your experience and all the strong messages that you passed also. We have a few questions on accountability, and we'll go back to that later. But first, I've got a question coming from Ndume, who is working for a local NGO in the DRC. And it's a very concrete question about the concrete steps for a local NGO to become a member of the HCT. What should they do?
Well, it's indeed a very good question, and we are trying here in CAR to promote as much as possible actually for them to be a member of the HCT. It is easier when we have a platform of NGOs, of national NGOs, because otherwise how are we going to select one NGO at the expense of another NGO? How are we going to make sure that actually this NGO is really representative of the other national NGOs? The point is that it's not having an NGO just as an individual, but really as someone who is also somehow liaising with the other NGOs and conveying all what is going on in the clusters and in the HCT, and at the same time mobilizing the other NGOs. So, they can approach OCHA, obviously, and this is something that can be discussed at the HCT, and they can join. We have been able to bring them definitely to the clusters. They are obviously part of the other mechanism, but I can tell you the problem here in CAR, and actually I was exactly facing the same issue elsewhere, is that as much as the international NGOs usually are very much, very well organized, they have the platform, when they designate an NGO, it's very clear. We are facing with some issues with the NGOs, with the national NGOs. So I'm really encouraging all of them to really organize themselves at the country level, so it makes it much easier and stronger for them to participate to the HCT and to all the coordination mechanisms when it comes to humanitarian coordination. Over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for the presentation, the reflections, and also the encouragement. I think some very, very important messages coming through, and we are so glad you could join us for the discussion. For our final speaker, we're going to give the floor over now to Mohammed Kilani. Very pleased to have you with us. Mohammed is Executive Director of the Jordan Hashemite Charity Organization, JHCO. Over to you, Mohammed.
Thank you very much for having me in this morning or evening. I would like to thank also the speakers before me that set up the theater regarding the concepts and what we are doing around the world. I represent here a national NGO, which is the Jordan Hashemite Charity Organization. We worked in about 38 countries around the world, and we emphasized on emergency response. Now, if I would like to come back to how we play in a coordination mechanism, we realized early that we needed to emphasize on coordination, because coordination is actually the key to success of providing aid in a timely and a sufficient and efficient manner. So we made sure that we have to do a lot of coordination and partnership with so many NGOs that we could, international NGOs. We also partnership with about 9 UN agencies. Of course, OCHA is one of the main ones, because it's also concentrating on coordination. We were successful to be in the home country team also in 2009 and in 2016. We also are part of the Jordan Response Humanitarian Plan. We were also, we joined actively in the clusters, UN clusters, working groups, and we co-share with WFP, the food security cluster. We also lobbied to be part of the Jordanian government committees that affected and that coordinate with regarding the Syrian crisis. So we are in the 3 highest levels, and we try to voice our voice the NGOs or international NGOs concerns, and we are the voice that represents the NGOs views and concerns in these committees. We also try to engage in regional coordination. So we work in the Arab League. We attended many meetings with them, and we in the regional also in the Islamic Cooperation Organization. We are one of the consultant NGOs that work in this forum. We also established a national platform for the local NGOs and the community-based organizations, with emphasis on capacity building or enhancing their capacity for these local and community-based organizations. Actually, we think that our success and our effectiveness always come from effective coordination in cooperating and engaging in all of these committees and these clusters. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mohammed, for your presentation. I have a question, actually, and I would like to know if you could elaborate a bit more on how you became the co-chair of the food security cluster and what it means in terms of task. What do you have to do?
Well, when we started the food security cluster, we were also engaged heavily in distribution of food around in the Za'atari camp and to the Syrians outside the government. So it was a logical choice that we established the cluster together with WFP. And as you know, there is in each cluster what we call it a democracy. So each time if somebody comes in and he nominates himself, after a while, the members will vote for his to be a co-chair. But we dedicated like two of our staff also to manage, and UNHCR also provided coordinator for the cluster.
Okay, so I think we're going to move on to the Q&A now. Thank you so much for sharing your experience. It's been really helpful, I think, as an example to share with this really diverse crowd that we have joining the discussion today. We're going to move now into the Q&A, and I believe our first question will be for Najat.
Yes, the first question is for Najat, and it comes from Muhammad, who is working in Pakistan. How do you think country-level coordination mechanisms aim to ensure or at least improve the transparency and accountability to affected people during a humanitarian response? Najat, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for the question. I think that the accountability and transparency to the affected people is not only an issue with the coordination mechanism. This is a duty for every single humanitarian, but also every single member of the HCT. I mean, it is definitely something that is very important for all of us, and I think the new compact that in the new TOR and in the new coordination mechanism, it is very important that we make sure that this is endorsed and that every single member of the HCT is really committed to this transparency and to this accountability to affected people. It is also important, and the way we are trying also to do it is through meeting on regular basis with the affected population and with the communities, but also with either the local authorities or the moral authorities and the leaders, the community leaders, so we can make sure that we speak the language of truth. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Najat. I've got another one about the assessment of cluster members as individuals. Does OCHA or the Humanitarian Coordinator assess cluster leads or members according to their performance as individuals or as members of an organization? Over to you.
No, the answer is very clear. I mean, I can tell you, I wish I could actually, because sometimes it's important, to make sure that the cluster leader is actually really doing the job the proper way, because so much of the efficiency of our response is really so much depending on the quality of the cluster work. But no, I mean, I have never been put in a position to be able to assess the cluster leaders, because they are reporting directly to their agencies or to the NGO, and therefore the assessment is laying with them, not with the HCT and not with the HT, or not with the OCHA.
Thank you very much, Najat. I've got a question for Kirk now, coming from Clément in Turkey. Asking about if you can go back to the difference between the clusters and the working groups that you mentioned before, how they are different from each other. Can you please elaborate a bit more on that?
Yeah, so clusters are a little broader. They have a wider membership than some of those working groups. So the technical working group should only be made up of technical experts in the field. So that would be in the nutrition cluster, your nutritionists and health professionals. Whereas the cluster might have, information managers and more generalist people taking part in it as well. Similarly, the strategic working group would probably be a little higher level than some of the rest of the cluster because it's really focused down on some of the strategy, whereas again, the cluster would just be a little more generic and general. The big one, I would argue, though, would be more the technical working group, which actually has membership requirements in most of the clusters, and those are that they have the technical capacity, like an engineer in the shelter cluster, for example, whereas those requirements don't really exist in the actual cluster.
Excellent, thank you. This is Anhara jumping in. I have I'd like to give the floor over to Paul. I believe that you might like to come in and make a comment on the accountability question. Over to you, Paul. You have the floor.
Thanks, Anhara. No, I just wanted to add to something that Najat said and underline it because I think it's really important. The accountability is obviously a central concern, and it more needs to be done, and a lot of agencies are working very hard on this, but we're not there yet, that's for sure. The problem, I think, inherent in this, though, is as with many things when we talk about coordination, is that we shouldn't assume that there is a response which is being accountable. What the reality is, there's lots of responses. And as Najat said, she doesn't have, OCHA doesn't have, the HC is not the boss, does not have control, cannot tell people what to do. So I think while we continue to write policy that assumes that there is something, this single monolithic response that is not there, the policy will not be implemented. The problem with accountability is the problem of, am I going to be accountable for what another agency who I disagree with has done? Probably not. And so instead, what we need to be thinking of is how, rather than a single kind of accountability approach, is how we can build better accountability into all of the organizations, first of all, and then how that can be, those pieces together to be more than the sum of their parts. And I know that the state missions, for example, now the peer-to-peer missions, have been doing a lot of work on this. And indeed in Central African Republic, I think there was a lot of work done by the Accountability to Affected Population Group, the IASC, as well. So the point I wanted to make there was just really that in order to make a situation better, you have to understand the situation. And the current situation is not one where there is a single response that can become more accountable or more anything. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Now I'm jumping on another topic and asking a question to Mohammed. It really calls on your experience as a co-chair of a cluster. Do cluster leads provide local NGO staff with training and coaching to improve their work in the field?
Actually, I don't think we do it in our cluster, but we do train and provide NGOs with the training that you have mentioned through engaging our new staff in my own organization to help me in the cluster. But we also make emphasis in capacity building to other NGOs through another national platform.
Excellent, thank you. And Hera jumping in with a question now for Kirk. So this is a question coming in from Kamran, who is based in Iran. And Kamran is asking about how the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement engages, if at all, in the UN-led country-level coordination mechanisms. Over to you, Kirk.
Oh man, that's a tough one. So the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement is represented to some levels in all of the various coordination structures. And that includes in the national level. I don't know the official positioning on the Red Cross, Red Crescent, so I can't speak to that. I can only speak to my own personal experiences, where I've definitely seen, especially local chapters of Red Cross very active within some of these areas. I'm thinking both about the Philippines, I'm thinking about Nepal, I'm thinking about some of these other ones as well. That being said, they are not as active as other, UN agencies of their size they would be. And I think that has to do with their mandates. I think, especially in complex emergencies, they would be very hesitant to get involved in these and to be seen as part of conflicts and parties to conflicts, but I'm not 100% sure. So that's just my own personal kind of take and experience on it, and if someone else has a better answer, I'd love to hear it.
Okay, thank you, Kirk. Before we close, because we are reaching to the end of the session, I've got a question for Najat, and it's really concerning the development coordination. It comes from Mutasem in Malaysia. And Mutasem asks, is there any similar clusters for development projects and not humanitarian? If so, how do they link each other following the current move towards a great humanitarian and development nexus? Sorry, Najat is not online anymore, so Paul, what do you think of this question about the link in between humanitarian and development, and is there any similar structure in the development sector?
It's a huge question and a great question. Which is coming front and center, is becoming really important with the post-WHS and the Secretary General's new way of working and all of the work around the humanitarian development nexus. I know that there have been a number of missions to a number of countries looking into how this might be affected. I mean, what I would say is there is a long way to go, because currently, as we've seen, humanitarian coordination, even within humanitarian actors, is imperfect. Secondly, the relationship between humanitarian coordination and development actors, which generally is currently done in terms of handover, so it should be done through exit strategies, is the most common mechanism. You know, you finish the humanitarian work and you phase out and phase into takeover by development actors, is one of the areas that the clusters in their self-assessments always say is the weakest. So there are many, many problems. I know people are looking for solutions. Those solutions probably, as we were suggesting earlier on, should be on a case-to-case basis. I mean, I think the best thing that could occur would be because all of these countries are in very different situations, and we have very intelligent people working on these problems on the ground. Some of them, many of them are here today, and I think the best approach is for HCTs and UN country teams, where those exist, because of course they also include NGOs, despite the name, to be looking at how they could solve this problem in their own context, and given the relations they already have with civil society and the government, piloting new ideas and sharing those ideas across the system. I think some centrally determined way of doing it is unlikely to be successful. I hope that answers the question, at least to a degree. Over.
Very, very well done, and thank you for that. So we're going to pose a question now to Mohammed. This is a question coming from James, who is actually with the Red Cross movement in Kenya. James is asking, humanitarian organizations develop and review their contingency plans on a regular basis. Joint review and sharing of these plans, however, has been lacking. How can humanitarian organizations best ensure that their assessments and plans are jointly developed and reviewed? And specifically, from your experience, Mohammed, does JHCO do joint assessments and planning with other NGOs and agencies? Over to you, Mohammed.
Thank you for this question. Yes, we do, and we have let's say 2 forums that we do the assessment of our readiness. One is we have a National Center for Crisis, and this center we are a member of. It's a governmental center, but involves also non-governmental agencies in it, where we all sit together and prepare and review our preparedness plans. Also, we do with our national platform through our training of capacity building. We also do review it together with our CBOs, community-based organizations, and with the other relative NGOs, sisters and brothers in Jordan.
Thank you, Mohammed. Finally, we have a last question that I will ask to Kirk about the cluster activation. Kirk, who decides on the cluster activation? Is it the HCT only, or the HC, or any other people are involved? And what is the role of the national authorities or the government in this process?
Good question. It's a combination of all of them. The key thing to stress is that the final decision making on all coordination structures in countries almost always comes down to the government. So that's an important point to highlight. If the government doesn't really want a cluster there, it's not going to be there. And there's probably numerous examples we can have where we might have had somewhat different coordination structures if the government was supportive of that. So that's a key point to highlight. Onto the HCT, the final decision making, the HC pushes up the decision to the global level with the ERC and the IASC, but it's done in consultation with the HCT. So someone actually in the chat a while ago said that they like the term leader more than boss, and I thought that was really a good observation, and I agree with that. So the HC really is the leader. So it is their kind of ultimate decision, but as that they'll consult with the HCT and make those recommendations. The other key thing to highlight is that not every country during an emergency will have an HCT right away. So in that case, obviously, if the HCT isn't informed yet, they wouldn't be involved. So I think those are three key points to make. That it's ultimately up to the government. The government kind of has final say. The HC is the ultimate decision maker, but it consults with the HCT.
Okay, excellent. So thanks so much to all of you who are staying a bit beyond the hour here, but we have had so many questions come in. We did want to be able to address at least a good number of them online. I also will mention with regard to the questions that we will be following up ICVA together with PHAP to try to ensure that all of the questions that we were not able to address live in today's session will be hopefully addressed in writing, and so you'll have those as a resource for you that will be distributed by email after the event to everyone who registered. So as we're wrapping things up now, I would like to go one more time around this virtual room. I know unfortunately Najat had to depart exactly on the hour, but to ask first Mohammed, then Paul, and then Kirk, if there's one parting thought that you would most like to leave with the group today, please do take just a few moments to share those with us. So we'll go first to Mohammed. Over to you.
Yes, I would like to emphasize that coordination also, although we would have these home country teams and these clusters, but it's very important to set up a reference, terms of reference to these teams that when they are working, and to make sure that the chemistry and the information available to these home country teams or to the clusters is available through an information system, sharing system, so they could fill the gap and make sure that we are upon stand at least presenting aid in a manner that would preserve the dignity of the beneficiaries and to be able to be as efficient as much as we can. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. And thanks so much for joining us today. Now the floor goes to Paul. Over to you.
Thank you. And thank you very much for organizing this. And thanks to the other speakers. I've really enjoyed it. My final thought would be to all of those of you who are involved or are going to be involved in coordination on the ground in these messages, please just keep doing it. The way forward, I think, there have been great improvements in coordination. As I was typing just now, there's a long way to go, but generally these improvements have come from the experience of people on the ground trying to solve difficult problems and coming up with new ways of solving these problems. And I wish that the policy that's generated around coordination could be more aligned with the practice and with what's working, and maybe that's where we need to be going in the future.
Wonderful. Thanks, and hope we have the opportunity to welcome you again in the future for one of these discussions. And now, last but not least, Kirk, over to you.
Yeah, I was actually going to go in a similar vein as Paul. I think the key thing to remember is that this, not to sound cliche or corny, is kind of like our system as well, and that it's never going to improve and it's never going to get better unless we kind of make the effort and put it into that. So if you're at the country level and things aren't working, make sure that you speak up and you influence the process in that country, whether it's through different cluster coordinators or HCTs and all these various things. It's easy to complain. It's harder to fix things. So just get involved and do the best you kind of can to make it better. And as Paul said, it really has improved over the last 10 years, and let's just keep improving it.
Okay. Great, an excellent message to end on. So thank you once again to all of our guest speakers who were able to join today, and to the large number of participants, again, from all over the world. Great to have all of your active participation in the chat, the polls, and so on. And we look forward to welcoming you for another event in the future. Looking at the audio and the video recordings, these resources and the other resources that were mentioned in the chat throughout the last hour and a half will be available in the next few days on the event webpage. And also, we will be conducting a translation of the video recording, and that will be available, therefore, with subtitles.
ICVA will also later put together a briefing paper on the topic discussed during today's session, and briefing papers are available in English, French, and Arabic. Also, I would like to announce that on the 20th of July, we will have our next learning stream on humanitarian coordination, and this time the session will focus on NGO fora and NGO consortia, highlighting their added value and the opportunities for NGOs to engage. The event will also explore the common challenges faced by NGOs working in consortia and what lessons have been learned being of interest to organizations already engaged or willing to engage in such structures. You can register now for this session by clicking on the banner.
Yes, and you can also register now for all of the other upcoming sessions in this series, which will be recommencing after the summer break. Again, you can click on the banners for the respective events. We have in September a session examining OCHA's role with NGOs in humanitarian coordination. Then on the 5th of October, we'll be sharing some information and potential implications of the new way of working. And then in November session, we will be discussing alternative coordination models.
A reminder about our previous session on the ISC and the humanitarian coordination mechanisms at the global level. You can now access the audio and video recordings of the session, and additional resources. You just need to click on the button in the bottom of the banner.
So I guess that's coming to the end of our time. Thank you once again to all of the participants for all of your active involvement, the very interesting questions that came in. Once again, I'll mention that we'll be ensuring that as many of those questions as possible will be answered in writing if we weren't able to get to them today. So you will have responses to those available to you, and we'll be notifying you in the follow-up email. I'd like to really warmly thank my co-host, Emmanuel. It's been a pleasure, and to all of the colleagues in PHAP and ICVA who have made everything possible behind the scenes with all of the pre-planning, and of course today making everything run smoothly.
And we'll see each other on the 20th of July. Thanks to all the participants.
That's all of us here signing off from Geneva. Have a good morning, afternoon, or evening.